Evolutionary.org Hardcore 2.0 coming your way. This is episode 78. We're going to talk about Testosterone Esters Revisited with Para Pharma. So this is going to be a really fun episode. We're going to go over the different testosterone esters that Para Pharma has to offer. We're going to talk about testosterone esters. We're going to talk about how they work. A lot of people that get this confused. They hear enanthate and cypionate and propionate. They don't know what that means. It's very important to know what it means. It's going to affect how you inject, when you inject, how much you inject. Okay, so there's a method to this. So we're going to educate you on that. Nobody else talks about this stuff. We're going to. We're going to give you the list of Para Pharma testosterone options. They got you covered from A to Z. Lots of different options. They got a really cool Sustanon blend that I haven't seen before. We're going to talk about that one. We're going to talk about using testosterone solo, how you can get a cycle out of using testosterone solo. We're going to talk about using testosterone in a stack with other Para Pharma steroids. And then we're going to talk about why Para Pharma, why we love Para Pharma. So this is going to be a really fun episode. So let's get right into it, Mobster. So first off, esters, why did some dude many, many years ago sit in a lab and decide to start adding esters to hormones? So you've got the testosterone hormone, and Para Pharma has a testosterone suspension, which we're going to talk about. The suspension doesn't have any ester attached. So we're going to talk about that because Para Pharma doesn't have that available. And that's an interesting one. We're tell you why people decide to use it in a second. But if you look across the board, 99.5 to 99.9% of the time, people are using these hormones with esters attached. So why did this guy decades ago, these guys, these geeks, these nerds, these science people sit in a lab?
Chemist, come on, be polite. They're just a chemist.
and decide to attach these esters. Why do they do that? It's so that when you inject it, it's not in and out of your system quick. So they inject it.
Let me jump in just for a second here, Steve. You and I did a history of steroids podcast some months ago, late last year, I believe. And when we discussed what was available to people in what used to be called the golden and silver and the bronze age of bodybuilding, weightlifting, way back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and even the 60s, we came across a couple of options for testosterone to prove that bodybuilders would have had access to steroids. And in fact, some steroid type concoctions were advertised in bodybuilding magazines in the 1930s. And the problem was that those options, which were no doubt provided by chemists and people that had their heads on in terms of the science back in the day, and even just for enhancing male virility, because that's how they were being promoted. The problem was, Steve, that they were in and out in your system in hours, in fact, like 2 or 3 hours. And you and I both know, and some of our listeners will know, that the problem with that was it's going to have zero effects on your ability to build muscle and get strong and get lean and compete on stage and whatever else, because it was just your own testosterone's in your system longer. Why would you take a male hormone derivative back in the 30s that was like in your system for 2 hours or 4 hours? It was kind of pointless. It was available. Some scientists had created it, but it was pointless. So the other side of things, which Steve and I have looked at before, and we've discussed on other shows, is simply this. And I've used this analogy multiple times. I say sometimes, if you want to understand something about a derivative of testosterone, a kind of which of the esters and the whys and the wherefores, you can be a chemist, and we can talk about esters that are used in perfumes. We can talk about esters that are used in food to enhance taste, and it gets a bit complicated. One of my buddies was able to tell you where the carbon atom was, the crystalline form, and all this kind of stuff. And if you're going to homebrew, you might maybe need to know that stuff. But in reality, it came down to the medical use. So, for example, let's say someone's got a medical issue, and the doctor decides to give them testosterone. Now, he knows that the medical issue they've got, Steve, the condition, it's going to last for fucking weeks. It's going to take weeks. It might take 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks to recover from. They may have had a terrible burn. They might be struggling with cancer, HIV, AIDS, any of these other medical conditions. This is not one pill and done. So, for example, let's say it's a burn. You are going to be laid up in bed with a really bad 3rd-degree burn, possibly lethal. And because you have got this skin that's fucking cracking, etc., etc., you don't really want to move. So they've got you dosed up, so you're kind of half out of it, and putting lotion on you, etc., etc. The issue here is this: you are going to be laying there, nigh on immobile, while in pain, trying to recover from essentially what is the most anabolic thing that can possibly happen to you. Catabolic as well, Steve. It's burnt you the fuck, and you're going to lose muscle tissue. So not only do they give you a medication that's going to help you recover from the burn in and of itself, i.e. treat the burn, but also they're going to try to inhibit muscle loss. There's no good you recovering from a burn, but coming out half the body weight that you went in is, and especially if you're an average Joe. Never mind if you're a massive muscular person or massively obese, just a normal 150, 160 pound Joe with his terrible burn and so on. Same thing with cancer. They're going to give you treatment, which is incredibly aggressive, really makes you sick. And that's just the treatment, never mind the actual cancer, and can lead to muscle loss again. And some you can have anti-catabolic, catabolic, anabolic, and so on and so forth. So certain treatments, certain medical issues require different esters. So you want one that might last a day or 2 days or 3 days or a week. And you might want another one that could be, and we know this is out there, 20 odd days. In fact, in the pre-show with Steve, I came across a list of stuff I've never heard of which at least 20 or 30 ester versions of steroids, anabolic, specifically androgen type steroids, I've never heard of, because these things never came to market. They were tested for various reasons, for different medical conditions. And one of the things we talked about as well is there is a massive list. I've actually said it's over 100, I believe, and that's every single one you can possibly think of. But the reality is you didn't need probably about 80 of those steroids, because the other 20 covered you. They did what you needed to be done. They treated the medical condition just as well. And different companies were coming out with different products that were slightly different when it came to the ester. But ultimately, one stood out as the treatment for a medical condition. Now, of course, we, bodybuilders, weightlifting athletes, etc., we have our own reasons for using them. And it can come down to what great condition we're in. So if we're obese versus being very lean, some of us want to maintain a body weight, but get more functional at their body weight because we live in weightlifting classes or compete in bodybuilding weight classes, height classes, and so on and so forth. We've got stuff. Literally, I came across one the other day called Femtest, Steve, which is a very low dose testosterone product that's specific to women. We talk about the oral versions and the injectable versions and so on and so forth. So it's all that kind of information. And the best way to describe it would be making sure that you have the right tool for the right job, specific to your requirements and so on and so forth. What do you think on that, Stephen? And any more information you can add?
So I'd simplify it like this. You inject an ester, it's a slow release. It's like when you go to the store, and you talked about it, Mobster, in the medical field. But let's say you go and you get the Mucinex, okay? You have a really bad cough, and you go to the doctor, and the doctor's like, well, you've got this virus, you got a lot of phlegm. Here, just go to the drugstore, get some Mucinex, break up the phlegm, you'll feel better. You'll be able to breathe better, right? So you go to the store, and they have the 12-hour Mucinex, they have the 24-hour Mucinex. Now, what's the difference? Now, the 24-hour Mucinex has a longer half-life, but it's going to take longer to peak in your system. So if you start taking it, it's going to take longer to peak in your system, but it's going to last longer in your body. The 12-hour Mucinex is more of, well, just a short term. I want to take it. I want to get quicker. I want to have it hit my body quicker, but it's going to be out of my system quicker as well. Maybe if I take it in the morning, by the time I wake up tomorrow, it's going to be in my system at a very small amount. Maybe I'll start having these problems. So I probably might want to take it again, like in the middle of the night. So no, I don't want to get up in the middle of the night. I just want to lay in bed. So let me go ahead and take the 24-hour Mucinex. It's going to be in my system the whole way. So it's the same thing with injecting, but it's more of a longer outlook. We look at these esters, you have anything from the shorter with no ester, suspension has no ester attached. Then you've got the propionate, which has a short ester attached. And then you have enanthate, and then you got cypionate, and on and on. You got these long esters. You got decanate and undeclinate, really, really long esters that can last in the system a long time. Something like libido, Nebido, which is some people use. Now, Para Pharma doesn't sell Nebido because there's no demand for it in the bodybuilding world when people cycle steroids, obviously. It'd be primarily used for people who are on long-term TRT who want to inject as infrequently as possible. Now, with Nebido, you're going to be injecting Nebido like once every 16 or 18 or 20 weeks because it has such a long half-life. But if you're going to use it like in a 12-week cycle, it does you no good because it's going to be such a slow release that if you're running a 12-week cycle of Nebido, you're not going to feel anything the first 12 weeks. It's not going to do shit for you, really. You may feel a little bit, but it's not going to do shit for you. And then it's going to be in your system a really, really long time after. So it's not going to be a 12-week cycle. It's going to be more like a long ass cycle because when you inject it, it's going to be slow releasing in your body, and it's going to also leave your body in a very slow manner as well. So this is why we talk about the way esters work is I always tell people, you look at the half-life of the ester, and the half-life will give you the indication of how long it's going to be in your body. Only half of what you injected will be in your body. That's the half-life. So if it has a 10-day half-life and you inject it on Sunday, it's going to take 10 days for half of it to be left over. And then you inject it again. Now you're getting more in your system. You're only getting half of that first injection leave. Then in another 10 days, you'll get half of what you originally injected out of your system. And what you injected the week prior, half of it will be out of your system, and on and on. But as you inject every week, it builds up in your system. But then it gets to the point where you have just as much being injected as leaving your system. That's when the steroid ester hits its peak. So I always tell people the rule of thumb is 4 to 5 times the half-life is how long it will take if you're injecting on a proper schedule for the ester to reach peak in your system. And on the flip side, after you stop injecting, this is why those of you who use steroids will notice, oh my God, I keep gaining. I keep feeling it in my system even after I stopped using my cycle. 12 weeks, I stopped injecting. I'm at week 15 and I still feel the hormones because it takes the same amount of time that it took to peak in your system as to leave. So if it has a 10-day half-life, it's going to take 40 to 50 days to be out of your system. So you'll still feel it in your system for 40, 50 days. When I run Sustanon, the Sustanon 250, which had the decanate ester attached to it, and it was a very, very long ester, right? Because it's 4 different esters, but mostly long esters. I was 4 or 5 weeks from my last injection, and I was still feeling the results and getting gains in the gym. And I didn't understand why. Nobody explained this shit to me. But now I'm explaining it to you so you don't have to be confused. Basically, it was still in my system. Then a couple weeks later, as it slowly got out of my system, then I started feeling that crash. And I was like, fuck, I feel that crash now because it took that long to be out of your system. So you got to understand these esters. A lot of people don't understand these esters. A lot of people think I just inject steroids and it's all going to hit my body. And like the next day I'm going to turn like into Arnold. And it doesn't work like that.
No.
And you have to understand that these esters slow release in the body, just like the Mucinex example. It slow releases in the body. So if you use that 24-hour Mucinex, it may not kick in for a little longer, but it will be in your system longer versus the 12
Let me
hour one.
expand, Steve, on why we would use different esters. I'll give you a couple of examples, okay? So example number one would be a competing bodybuilder. And I've said this before. Some of them have training gurus, some of them have diet gurus, some of them have what we call prep gurus, and sometimes a combination of training and the diet. But more often than not, it includes the steroid stack and cycle that they're going to do to prepare for a competition. And one of the great advantages, let's say it's a 16-week prep. So day one is you off-season condition, and in 16 weeks' time, it's you on stage kicking ass, hopefully kicking ass. The beginning of the prep might be longer esters, but the end is nearly always short ester products, stuff that's in and out in days. And the reason for that is what we call flexibility. What do we mean by that? Because we haven't got an idea. We might have something of an idea, but truthfully, especially if it's someone we're working with for the first time as a prep coach, we haven't got an idea necessarily that we can look back at that person and say, this is exactly how they're going to look at a week out, exactly how they're going to look at 10 days out, exactly how they're going to look at 3 days out, and so on and so forth. So we have the ability to control what's going on in the body, certainly when it comes to testosterone and specifically steroids and things like diuretics, etc., and all the other stuff that people do to get stage ready by having the shorter acting products go into their body. Now, equally, and I'm not a huge fan of this personally myself, and I say as much online, there are people that will use a longer ester because they're going to do a 12 or a 16-week cycle, but they want to feel, and that's that word is specifically the effects of testosterone. They like how they feel when they're on steroids. And this isn't necessarily what we call the addictive part. It's literally the difference between, and I'll be euphemistic here and expand slightly, say the difference between being off and being a beta and on and being an alpha. That sort of sense of well-being, that kind of sense of aggression, the sense of being more kick-ass and whatever else that can come with some people being on testosterone. So they will say stuff like, and Steve and I not always agree and disagree on this particular product, but say, I want to kickstart my cycle because I want to feel like I'm on. I like how I feel when I'm on. So I want to get the results straight away. Now, ironically, I don't think the end result differs too much, but I do understand that there might be a sense of well-being that comes with the kickstart. And obviously the finish is a little bit different, but the sense of well-being that comes with that is quicker, and because you've used a short ester. Yeah.
I was gonna say we're gonna definitely talk about that. We'll talk about ways you can, kickstart and ways you can stack things later on in the podcast. So basically stick with that. But before we move on to the next topic, I want to kind of go over the half-life esters and how long they are. Now, depending on where you're getting your information, you're going to see variations to this. And look, at the end of the day, let's not make a big deal over a couple days here and there. So give or take the averages that you can work with when you're deciding on which ester to pick. Test propionate, we're talking 4 days. And, I've seen 3 days, I've seen 4.5 days, but I'd say around 4 days with testosterone propionate. Test E, 7 days. Test SIP, 10 days. So looking at those numbers, again, it's the half-life. It's not how long it's in your system and poof, it's gone the next day. It's the half-life. So when you're deciding on a cycle, if you want to do a short cycle, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, you may want to go with the test probe because it's going to be in your system quicker, and it's going to be after you stop, it's going to be out of your system quicker. So your body can start. Remember, your body isn't going to start recovering till these are completely out of your system. Okay. So if you want to recover quicker, you want to run a short cycle, recover fast, take a break, then jump back on. Then you go with the shorter esters. If you don't mind staying on, you're talking about test E 7 days. Test SIP 10 days. These are longer esters. You can get away with injecting test E a lot less frequently than test probe, and test SIP less frequently than test E. So with test probe, how often do you want to inject? Every other day, every 3 days is perfectly fine. I'm a big believer in esters. Some people don't believe in them. Some people think, oh my God, test probe, you got to inject it every day to get a balanced number, whatever. I'm a big believer in esters. You may initially not have a balanced number, but as you stay on it over a course of a couple weeks, 2-3 weeks, it will balance out on its own. That's what esters do. They balance out. So I would even argue with test probe, you can inject test probe 2 or 3 times a week and be perfectly fine. And a lot of people, like I said, people are going to argue that. But I'm telling you, I've seen the blood work. I could tell you that's how it is. But if you want it in your system quicker, you can go ahead and inject it every day. I don't care what you do. I'm just telling you the facts. Test E 7 days. You can inject it once or twice a week with test E, no problem. Yes, if you inject it and then you inject it once a week, it may tail off a little bit the last day or two. But when you inject it again, it's going to go back up again. And then over time, it's going to balance itself up. Again, the esters help balance things out. As you're putting stuff in, some is leaving. So it's a balance. Test SIP 10 days. Once a week, perfectly fine. Every 10 days, perfectly fine. Every 2 weeks. TRT clinics are doing test SIP every 2 weeks. So don't tell me you can't do test SIP every 2 weeks if the doctors are actually doing that with their clients. So you could do it. And these are the options that Para Pharma has. And we're going to get into also the testosterone suspension in a mix, which is the Sustanon 350 that they have on the next segment. So, Mobster, let's get into that. Unless you have something else to add.
Now let's move on.
So let's get into the different Para Pharma testosterone options. So let me give you the list really quick, and then we'll kind of Mobster will give his thoughts. So this is sort of the list that this is the first one is the most popular one. All right, testosterone Cypionate 250. This is the biggest seller of anything out there when it comes to hormones. All right, and it's the most used out of anything. And that was based on polling, and that was based on sales, and that's based on the data that we have. And Para Pharma has a really good testosterone cypionate. So let's say you're running a cycle, a 10-week or 12-week cycle, and you want to use the testosterone by itself, or you want to use it in a stack. The testosterone cypionate is very easy to use. The thing I like about it is that it's smooth. It's a smooth injection. Para Pharma does a really good job of making it even more smooth than smooth. And you don't have to inject it very often. As I said, once a week, twice a week, once every 10 days, once every 2 weeks even, perfectly fine. But of course, if you're running it on a cycle every 10 for 10 to 12 weeks, you want to inject it every week. You want to get it in your system, you want to get it going in your system. So usually most guys will inject it once or twice a week. But if you're using it for long-term TRT, you can inject it once a week or once every 2 weeks very easily. Then they have a Para Pharma Test E250 and a Test E400. And I'll let Mobster talk about those.
Yeah, I mean, just on the first option there, Steve, that would be my choice for TRT. And Steve's quite correct in saying, when he mentioned it earlier on about the TRT reference, because very rare to see TRT type clinics, life extension type clinics, using other choices. We have seen them, but it's not common to say the least. Cypionate certainly a few years ago was the number one choice of TRT clinics. And a bunch of my buddies, and I've even said this just recently on the forums, that I'm looking at possible TRT after my 60th birthday not long ago. And SIP is probably going to be my number one choice as well, Steve. And I could see me certainly to begin with 200 milligrams, maybe maxing out at 300 milligrams there or thereabouts. So this would be a perfect choice from Para Pharma. The Enanthate 250 and the Test Enanthate 400, the TE 400. For me, and I've talked about this before. Firstly, it's slightly shorter in terms. This is a back and forth, like Steve says, because see so many different variations of numbers. Super popular with my buddies, and I've talked about this as well. So, for some particular reason, I've used exactly the same product as they did, and didn't seem to get from the Test Enanthate what I've had from other products. And yet my buddies absolutely raved about it. And they were all at that point, I think one was an unlimited super heavy, but everybody else was limited to a weight class. And for them, this was the base of their strength stack. They weren't going to be using trend. That would come later on. There was other things that they were doing. They might put an all in the mix, etc., etc. But for them, injecting, testing Amphate, typically 200, 300 milligrams twice a week, was el numero uno for them. And I just had that puzzled look on my face as to why I wasn't responding or getting the same sort of strength boost that they got. But it's definitely one for people out there in that particular regard, Steve, and that's just the strength community. I'd also probably suggest this is probably the second most popular form of testosterone. And again, like Steve says, something else as well. I want to expand on something else as well, Steve, in terms of personal choice and why you might see variation in terms of half-life and why you might, as in my case, see variations in response. And that comes down to physical condition. The difference between someone who's overweight with a lot of body fat and someone who's lean can be night and day in terms of the speed into the system and the response to a particular PED versus, for example, the other guy. So just as an example, someone who's super lean, super lean, muscular already, perhaps genetically predispositioned to handle PEDs very well, will see and or feel a response quicker than someone using an identical, say, let's be moderate dose, let's say 300 milligrams of a product, and we'll see a different response, a quicker response versus the person that's a 20, 25, 30% body fat. So there's a thing there. There's some also science which is a little bit confused, even for me, when it comes to steroid receptors and uptake and so on and so forth. So, for example, again, the person who's overweight, carrying a lot of body fat, probably has lower testosterone. So they're almost making up for that low testosterone before they actually get into the part where it becomes anabolic and so on and so forth. And again, the problem with the science is the science generally does a group and then gives you the results or averages for the whole group. If they broke it down to obese, moderate, lean, super lean, etc., I suspect, Steve, we will see different numbers across the different kind of body fat and percentage ranges, etc. But so again, any information you give in that regards, including us, is a kind of generalized. Here's what will apply to the majority of you. You're always going to have outliers, so keep that in mind. And again, I didn't respond the same as my buddies. Of the two, if I did respond very well, Steve, I think I'd probably go with the 250. That's for a couple of reasons. 2 jabs of that a week, solo. This is not stacked. We're getting the stacks later on. It's 500 milligrams, which is fabulous. There's a great argument to be made when it comes to testosterone, Steve. Everybody seems to sort of say 500 milligrams. You don't have to do 500 milligrams, but it's kind of one of those generalizations again. At 500 milligrams, if you can't grow on 500 milligrams of testosterone solo or as part of a stack, then look at your training, look at your nutrition, and so on and so forth. If I was competing, I might look at the test in F8 400. And again, this is if I responded, and especially if I was a real big guy, I'd probably do 3/4 of a meal myself twice a week again. I don't think I'd want to run it more than twice a week. I know that it's another quick aside for you, Steve. I know that there are people that I'll talk about testosterone microdosing, and that would be a small amount of a faster acting or even a slower acting ester of testosterone, but small amounts every day. Now, I've had a look at that. I can't see it for myself. I suspect it mostly comes down to how that person feels when on testosterone. I don't think the leveling up, so to speak, so that there's a level of testosterone is necessarily the best way to go. I don't think it makes much of a difference overall. I'd love to be proved wrong. I'd like to see someone out there that can say, listen, this is a result I had doing it twice a week. This is a result I had microdosing daily, and so on and so forth. I'd love to see that because obviously that'd be informative for us and for you, the listener, as well. What do you think on that, Steve, before we move on to the test prop?
Yeah, I mean, we know the data. I mean, we see the blood work. I've seen thousands of blood work, so
Yeah.
you completely get away with test E once a week, twice a week. That's perfectly fine. And it just depends on your situation. Para Pharma again does a really good job of keeping it smooth. So the test E400, if you're scared of post-injection pain, Para Pharma does a really good job of cutting that down. So that would be something not to be scared of. You can definitely give it a shot.
It used to be a massive issue, Steve, as you know, but recently, and we discussed this on another show, so make sure you listen to our other shows. We discussed this on other shows. It used to be a massive issue back in the day, guys, but I don't think I've heard hardly more than 1 or 2 complaints in the last 12 months when it comes to post-injection pain, where it used to be real common. So including Para Pharma, got much better at producing blends, much better at producing high concentration products. The oils are much smoother than they used to be, and so on and so forth. And so a good company like Para Pharma produces a solid product, and you will hear, like I said, maybe 1 or 2 complaints from someone who's a little bit more sensitive. Otherwise, it's a lot easier to take a high dose of product than it ever used to be in the past, Steve.
Test Prop 100 Para Pharma. This is one that people like to use. Let's say you like flexibility. Let's say you want to use a shorter, I talked about it earlier in the podcast. You want to go a shorter cycle, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, even 9 or 10 weeks, and you want it in and out of your system quick because you want to rebound. You want to have your HPTA come back strong. You don't want to be shut down a long period of time. We know the longer you're shut down, the harder it is to recover. So if you want it in and out of your system quicker, you don't mind injecting more often. The nice thing about Para Pharma Test Prop 100 is, again, they do a good job of cutting down on the post-injection pain, unlike other propionate. So with this one, you can pin it every 2 days, every 3 days, every 3.5 days. You'll be perfectly fine. Some people like to do it every day. Just depends. And the nice thing about it is it's in your system a lot quicker. So you'll start feeling the peak of test probe because it has only a 4-day half-life. Remember what I said earlier, 4 to 5 days times the half-life. So if we take 4 times 4, we get 16. So if you start injecting this stuff, let's say every other day or every third day, after about 16 or 17 days, you'll start having the peak in your system. Doesn't mean you're going to be peaking your strength, but what it means is you're just going to be peaked in your system where you'll feel those effects of testosterone. A lot of people like that. And then when you stop taking it, on the flip side, it's going to be out of your system quicker. So if you want to jump right into PCT and then recover quicker, have a nice rebound, take a little break, and then jump back into another cycle in the future, you could go that route. Of course, it depends what you're stacking it with. And we're going to get into that in a couple segments from now, how to stack test propionate with something else, because you're going to want to stack it with something also with a short ester if you want to keep your cycle short. It doesn't make sense to stack test prop with a long ester and then that kind of defeats the purpose of having a shorter
Yes.
cycle. You see what I'm
Yes.
saying? But here's the other way you can use test probe. You can use it to be more flexible. Mobster talked about kickstarting earlier. You can throw in, if you like testosterone in your cycle, you like the way it makes you feel, you like
Yep.
the libido and the strength, you could use it as a kickstart in your cycle along with a longer ester testosterone. That's the whole idea behind Sustanon, which is a blend, because a lot of people like to feel the effects quick of the ester. So you can do your own little mix of testosterone blend. Also, on the flip side, on the end of the cycle, if you're a competitor or you're doing
Yes.
photos or you're going on vacation and you want to look diced, and testosterone is one of those things where, because it aromatizes the estrogen, a lot of people look a little fluffy on it. So what they'll do is they'll stop the testosterone propionate ahead of their couple weeks ahead of their competition or 3 weeks ahead of their competition. This way, by the time their competition comes and they're on stage, that testosterone's out of their system and they look diced. If you're running a longer ester of testosterone, it's still going to be in your system once you stop taking it after 2 or 3 weeks. You're going to have to wait 5, 6, 7 weeks for it to be out of your system. You see? So if you like that flexibility of I can start and stop and have the effects either come in my system or be out of my system, testosterone propionate is for you. Now, the disadvantages of testosterone propionate are what I talked about, the injecting. It's a pain in the ass. And testosterone propionate historically has had more post-injection pain. Although, as Mobster said, Para Pharma does a great job of
A lot
limiting
better. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
post-injection pain. There is going to be some there in some of you, and some of you may
Yes.
not notice anything at
Yes.
all. I've seen some
Not
people
everybody.
say
Yeah.
they ran the Para Pharma test probe. They said I didn't have any post-injection pain at
Yep.
all. So it really just depends. But obviously, you're injecting it more. It's only 100 milligrams a milliliter, so it's going to require more injecting, and you may
Yes.
not like that. It may not be what you're looking for, but the flexibility gives it the advantage.
One more thought, Steve, and this specifically applies to any of the shorter esters, and it certainly used to apply previously, but I'll explain why it doesn't necessarily apply now. So it used to be that if a ester was in your system less time, like was shorter ester, it would be good for testing purposes, and that was certainly the case, say 15 or 20 years ago. Unfortunately, the reality of the situation is when it comes to testing, you might have, say, for example, Steve just said, that kind of fluffy sensation that some people might have using one of the esters there, and you don't want to have that look, and you want the product to clear the system, and obviously if you just start to shine and look good, etc., that can actually be one of the reasons why he was getting tested. He looks like he's on steroids. We should have him tested. And of course, it used to be the case that, the short rest that clears the system relatively quickly. As Steve says, if it's 4 days, then it's out of your system in 16 days. Great, just in time for a competition. I've built myself up. I've got muscle. I've got strong, but there won't be nothing shown in my bloods when I go for a test. The reality, of course, is now that most of the testing is a lot better than it used to be, and the WADA IOC stuff is shit hot. And so, what used to be true, it completely depends on the organisation you're with and what kind of testing they're doing. But it used to be true that you could get away with it. I would argue that you're probably risking getting caught if you're a wrestler or a runner or even MMA, especially the pros, where we're seeing way more positive tests, and they're going back looking 2 years on A and B samples and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, that was another reason, Steve. Quicker in, quicker out. and so on and so forth. I was also thinking when it comes to the prop again, that was one of the ones where he was almost, and I won't say finishing because that's what you would apply when you're talking about a finisher for bodybuilding, but I have heard of powerlifters and athletes specifically using something that was short acting to really boost their levels of testosterone the last few days before competition, especially if they wasn't being tested, on top of whatever else they've done in the cycle and the training, just to be absolutely as goddamn muscular strong as they possibly could be on the day of a competition. But again, look at the federation. Are you being tested? Look at what you're doing. Just because that's what a powerlifter does doesn't mean that's what you've got to do. So that's why you have these options as well. Talk about test suspension, Steve. So specifically, of course, as you mentioned earlier on, not actually having an ester.
Yeah, and this is the original testosterone molecule that they developed, and the testosterone suspension basically is going to be taken. It's going to be in your out of your system because there's no ester, there's no slow release. So it's boom in your system and your body gets rid of it. In your system, your body gets rid of it. So this would be an option really for two different scenarios, and this would be something you could take pre-workout to give you like a big testosterone boost, which to me is kind of stupid. And I'll explain why. Because what's the difference between using another testosterone with an ester and having it in your system already? So it's in your system when you go work out. It's in your system post workout. It's in your system when you go to sleep. It's in your system the
Yep.
next morning. It's in your system the next day, blah, blah, blah. And you just had to inject it and it's in your system for days versus just taking testosterone suspension pre-workout and moving to your system. Some people claim like, oh my God, it's a psychological thing. Some people claim, oh my God, it makes a difference. But in reality, if you look at the actual numbers, the math doesn't lie. You're going to have the same amount of testosterone in your system when you take testosterone suspension at the same dose as you would taking a longer ester at the same dose. You see what I'm saying? So you can make both things happen the same way. It's just that you went
Yeah.
from having no hormones to boom, a lot of hormones within
Yeah.
60 minutes. And then you feel that, oh my God, that you feel that effect. So really, it's not going to make any difference. The same reason Mobster doesn't believe in kickstarting, it's the same logic as this. At the end of the day, it's the same amount of gear
Yeah.
that's in your system. But
Yeah.
here's
I mean, let me expand on that just for a
yeah,
second,
go ahead,
guys.
go ahead.
And I've done this with, I can actually think of a good reason and a bad reason. Right. So when it comes to the pre-workout thing, there's a big argument to be made for the psychological stuff because the great and vast majority of users are going to respond in the same way. I think it comes down to the very small select group, for example, fighters, MMA, cage fighting, boxing, etc., and you'd need to be arguably like a sort of finely conditioned racehorse, super lean, very, very fit, at the top of your game, ready to rock and roll, that championship fight, the belt fight, etc. And you specifically need to be sensitive in terms of how you respond to testosterone. The reality of that, you're looking at maybe 10, 15% of listeners. The other 85, 90% are going to respond in much the same way because they're average Joes with the same kind of levels of body fat, etc. So if you do respond in that way, great advantage. And we talked about what, for example, we thought maybe Mike Tyson might have done pre-fight, and we discussed options that he might have used, etc. In regards to the kickstarting finishing thing, the finishing makes more sense. Kickstarting makes less. And again, Steve's quite correct when he talks about flexibility. How you want to start your cycle, how you feel when you're on cycle, which I touched upon as well. But the kickstarting for me is show me the result. Because if it's a question of I'm going to use a longer rest, why? Because you could use a short rest if you want to. I don't do like a lot of pinning, but I'm going to do something at the beginning. I want to see what the end result is, and the end result doesn't change. The end result might change with a finisher. It might change with you adding, for example, EQ or Winstrol or something like that at your end of your cycle in order to bring in that better condition, in order to look better on stage, in order to have a physique that shines more. But it makes no difference at all at the beginning to your physique. You don't suddenly put a quarter inch of your arm. You don't suddenly drop 5% body fat and so on. So for me, the kickstart is way more of I'd like to feel the effects of testosterone working quicker, but there's no one, certainly not the average user, that can show me a result of a physique that they got which was enhanced by having a kickstart. You can do what you like. As Steve said, it's your body. We're trying to educate you. We're giving our opinions. And of course, we're trying to come at it from sort of an analytical, logical point of view. But again, different users, different responses, etc., etc. And at the end of the day, it's your buck. You spend it how you want. And if you do feel the effects, then more luck to you, and you crack on with the kickstart. For me, the finisher and the actual cycle itself makes more sense. And that's just in terms of the actual out and out result. Give you an example, Steve. If the kickstart worked for me in terms of strength, I'd actually arguably be at a greater risk of injury. But I still like the idea of being stronger quicker. I mean, that's fabulous. But in reality, I suspect it's a build up in my system, a combination of training, nutrition, rest and recovery that produces for me, and of course, as a strength athlete, I want to be stronger at the end of the stack because I'm going to compete at the end of the stack, at the end of the training cycle. And for the most users, that would still be the case, whether it's a look, a physique. So, for example, kickstarting won't change your diet, kickstart won't change your training. So the end result is still what you're looking for. It's a sensation of being on testosterone quicker. I can't see that, having a short-acting ester in your system for the first week, while the longer-acting stuff builds up in your system with the regular injections, makes any difference to the end result. If it did, we'd see it all the goddamn time, and especially in pros. But again, flexibility, how you feel, your personal choice, etc., etc. It's all out there. But yeah, suspension, like Steve said, is basically just pure testosterone. And again, as I touched upon at the beginning of the show, that was kind of almost what was available to you historically, but it was so quick in the system. It's up there perhaps with pre-workouts and stuff like that, Steve. And of course, you and I don't really go crazy on those either. I'm very much a believer in get yourself G'd up, have your focus, have a reason for going to the gym, and let that be what drives you. I do understand, and this might be the only other reason why I would consider it, Steve, in this situation. I don't have to physically work, and I certainly don't have to do the manual laboring type work that I've done back in the day. Now, whether that's in an office, in a shop, in a supermarket, or down a fucking coal mine with a pick and a shovel and a drill and whatever else. Now, I have done physical work back in the day, and I completely then understand that if you're doing that kind of hard manual labor, the idea that you could take something like suspension that's going to make you want to go tear the gym up after you've done a hard labor, 8-hour, 10-hour, 12-hour shift. I get it. I understand that. And that's the reason why pre-workouts are popular. That's the reason, well, one of the reasons. And that's the reason why perhaps suspension might be useful. As I said earlier on, if you are sensitive to testosterone, I could see suspension being used by a fighter, Steve, a cage fighter. If they feel their little edge from testosterone, something like suspension might just enhance that again. So that sense of aggression, that sense of I'm going to go in there and kick that geezer's ass. I'm going to take that guy down. I'm going to show him who's the boss. That might be another reason for using it as well in that situation.
Well, I'll tell you the number one reason for using it is that it's undetectable. And that's why if you were a football linebacker, you're going to want to take it, because if they call you up and say, Mobster, you got to show up in 3 days to get dope tested. And you're like, okay, no problem. And you just took the suspension, you're going to pass because it's not going to be detectable in 3 days. So that would be the number one reason for people to use testosterone suspension. So if you're a tested athlete, this is the way you could cheat. Also, growth hormone be out of your system because it is a peptide. It's going to be not detectable. People try to test growth hormone through blood work and they have a really hard time. So can you imagine them trying to dope you for it? Same thing.
Let me give you an insider thing. Steve says we talk about the things that other people don't talk about. One thing to watch out for, to keep this in mind, even if they can't say, oh, X is used cypionate, X is used in amphate, what they can do is the ratio. And if you're on the test and use a small amount, don't use a big amount. So don't be putting 300 and 400 milligrams in if you might be tested. Because even if you do get one of those random tests, Steve, and your ratios are 12 or 15 to 1, you're fucked. If your ratios are in the same range, you're not fucked. And you've got to watch your estrogen ratios. You've got to watch. Steve talks about this all the time. Get your own goddamn bloods done, Steve. That would be the way to do it. And definitely have a really good understanding of how your body works. If I was a pro linebacker, I'd employ a motherfucker. I'd have someone who's testing me regularly for my own purposes. How do I respond on this? How quick is it in my system? What's my chances of being found positive? And again, if I'm on multi-million-dollar contracts, if I can afford to pay some motherfucker 50, 60, $100,000 a year
Yeah.
to make
They can
sure that
call
this
me
stuff
up.
is
I'm
100%.
available if they want to pay me
Yes,
100,000 for
yes,
that. I'll do it for them.
yes.
Let's get into the next one. Yeah.
Stephen, do it. Go
Let's
on,
get into
Steve.
the last one Para Pharma has among testosterone. The Susta 350. Now, this is a very unique sustanon. I've never seen anything like this. This is going to be a blend of 200 milligrams of test D, 100 milligrams of test sip, and 50 milligrams of test pro. So it's very, very different than the regular Sustanon 250 out there. The regular Sustanon 250, first of all, a chunk of it is going to be the decanate ester. And that's a long ester. That's a 16, 17-day half-life ester. So it's designed to basically take longer to peak in your system, take longer to be out of your system. So it's designed for TRT. And the regular Sustanon is definitely designed for TRT. This Sustanon is not necessarily designed for TRT, although it could be used for TRT. But this is more designed for someone who wants to go 12 weeks, 14 weeks on the cycle. And the nice thing about this one is because the majority of it is test E. So you can treat it like test E. So you can pin it once a week, twice a week, and you'll be perfectly fine. But it also has a little bit of test pro. So it kind of acts like a kickstart when you take it. It gives you a little bit of test pro right away that you'll feel within the first week. And then it gives you the test E, which you'll feel intermediate, and it'll give you the test sip, which will be in your system a little longer at 100 milligrams. So this is a really good one. It's very, very important to understand this one and understand how it works. So it's 350. So the way I would use this one, this is for you if you're gonna do a 12 or 14-week cycle and you want to inject once a week, 1 cc, and be done with it. And this is a great way to do it because it's 350 milligrams per cc. So you would just inject 1 cc a week. It'll take you 2-3 minutes and you're done. You got 350 milligrams of testosterone in your system for the week, which is 3.5 times what your body normally produces. You're done. Or you could go 2 cc's if you wanted to do 700 milligrams a week. So that's pretty cool. So this Para Pharma option is really good, and people do buy it for that reason.
For me, Steve, and you know how much of a fan I am of Sustanon, I'm used to using a 4 ester blend, and we have seen one, I believe, example, which was 5 esters. That was very unusual again. This, for me, I'd actually use it slightly less than I would normally do it in terms of time scale. So something Steve mentioned at the beginning of the show was the ester clearance, and I've used Sustanon on the deck as my favorite bulking cycle, and I even wrote in my log saying I couldn't understand, and I should have understood, couldn't understand why I was still able to do X and Y poundage for this week and 2 weeks, and I think they're coming on 3 weeks after. Of course, I should have bloody known, Steve, precisely why I was still able to do it, because steroids hadn't cleared my system. This would actually clear my system slightly quicker. In terms of my own physical response, so like I said just now, 3 weeks after my Sasteka cycle that I did in October, I was still hitting big numbers, and it just started to drop off from the end of week 3. For me, the way that this has been put together, I think I'd be starting to see the numbers drop off a week earlier, so 2 weeks afterwards. Still useful for me. I'd probably run it ever so slightly more frequent in terms of pinning compared to what I would normally use. So again, this is that flexibility, having the option out there with Para Pharma for something. So I would normally do an 8 or 12-week cycle. I could actually see me, this would be my 8-week cycle choice, rather than say 12, 14, 16 weeks with the slightly longer, slightly more esterized versions, 4 esters and the 5 ester versions of Sustanon or testosterone blends that we've seen. This will be slightly shorter for me. Again, user, you're the listeners, you out there have got your own particular aims and desires, etc. when it comes to training. So you have a choice. If you respond the way that I respond, then this would be a choice for you, ever so slightly less. The normal situation, as Steve said earlier on, certainly with a declinate, would be ever so slightly longer, 12, 16 weeks. So definitely a flexible option for listeners to use, specific to their own requirements. I mean, again, if say for example, so I got an email today, Steve, and someone said there's £2,000 for you to come and compete in 8 weeks in a grip strength competition, and all the lifts suit you down to the ground. This, I'd be ordering this today. Get it to me as quick as you can, guys, because I think this would be perfect for that. If on the other hand it was one of those, oh, I'm going to be training for later in the year or early in the new year, 2025, then I'd probably take a slightly longer version, and I'd think about stacking it later in the year, ready for early 2025. So again, options and choices. These are the reasons why these products are created that way. This is the reason why Para Pharma's put a product out like that, and it enables me to make the perfect choice for what's coming up for me. Let's talk about briefly, guys, how we've run testosterone, whether it's straight testosterone or testosterone blends, etc., etc. So, like I said, I mean, look, upcoming for me in 5 or 6 weeks' time, Steve, I'll be 60 years of age and recovering from my most recent cycle. I have big time consideration on, maybe it's time, Steve. Maybe Mobster needs to go on TRT. Maybe you need to start thinking about it. So for me, again, and as I said earlier on in the show, Steve, cypionate, 200 milligrams, 300 milligrams a week, 3 weeks on, 1 week off, get my bloods done twice a year would be the perfect choice in my particular set of circumstances as it currently is. And I would use that as a base of any particular cycle that I was going to add to. And also, because I've never used cypionate in that way before, I would definitely look at maybe, running it at 200 milligrams, seeing how I feel, what's my energy like, what's my training like, before I start to think about doing another cycle, say later in this year. I'm trying to stay off as long as possible, but TRT is a definite option there. I've touched upon the enanthate, and of course, for me, Steve, bulker of all bulkers, and let me just use Sustanon as an example here in terms of dosing and so on and so forth. So my most recent bulk cycle, late October last year, consisted of Sustanon and Deca. I always do incredibly well on those. And it's actually the first time ever I've gone over a gram. And to be perfectly honest, apart from the fantastic numbers I was doing and being the heaviest I've ever been in my life, I actually think I'd probably run now, try to keep any future bulking cycle under a gram. Typically in the past, I've been looking at the combined numbers of around 700, 800 milligrams a week. They say the most recent cycle in that way was 1,050, which is the first time I've ever gone over. I'm thinking 800, 900 is going to be my sweet spot if I ever do anything like that again. As I get older, putting on 20 or 30 pounds a cycle cannot be good. So I want to moderate that a little bit. Don't need to get that big. It's only going to be temporary, but it does enough push the strength up for me absolutely through. What about you, Steve, before we talk about Para Pharma? What kind of testosterone, what's your experiences and dosage you've run?
So let me give you some advice. Our bodies naturally produce somewhere around 100 milligrams a week of testosterone. So if you're going to run more than that, you're going to have more side effects. You're going to have more estrogen and androgenic issues. So it's very, very important, first of all, the more higher you run. If you run 150, it's not going to be as much side effects as you run 500 or 1,000. So the more you run, you want to make sure you compensate. So when it comes to androgenic side effects, you're going to want to run your support supplements. Come on the forum. We'll recommend the best support supplements that you can run while you're on it. When it comes to estrogen, you're going to want to run an aromatase inhibitor. And Para Pharma has you covered. They have 8X, they have Aromasin, they have Letro. So I would suggest you pick up Aromasin. That's the number one recommended AI out there. And it's always recommended also you keep some Letro on hand just in case in an emergency. That can't hurt for you to spend a little bit extra money to keep Letro on hand in case something goes wrong and it's an emergency and you need to drop your estrogen quick. So those are really good options when it comes to testosterone. Now, the average dose of testosterone when you're running it solo is going to be 500 milligrams a week. And we already touched on how often you should pin these different esters. So from here, it's up to you to make a decision on which route you want to go. And as we said, the number one most popular option is cypionate. The number two most popular option is enanthate. And then from there, if you want to, dip your toes into it, those are going to be the two I would go with to keep things simple. Now, as you go on, you want to try something a little different. You want to have a little more, variety, then you could start experimenting with the other ones that we talked about. When it comes to the propionate, if you want the flexibility, when it comes to the suspension, if you're a tested athlete or you want to try it pre-workout to see, does this shit really work? For me, give me a little psychological boost. And then the Sustanon, if you want a blend that you can just pin once a week and be done with it and keep things simple. So it's really one of those situations where you start experimenting. And then you can experiment as well with stacking. Para Pharma has different steroids that you can stack with them. We don't have time to get into the stacks, but we're going to have more Para Pharma episodes coming up where we will get into the stacks. So we're going to save that for you guys. You guys can lick your chops on that. So look, at the end of the day, Para Pharma, I'll bring in Mobster to finish out the podcast with his thoughts. But let me just say this about Para Pharma. They've been around a long time. They have a lot of different options. They have certificates of analysis on their products. When you buy Para Pharma, you're getting high quality. You know what you're getting. The testosterone that you're taking is dosed right. We had Guy come on the forum. He was using TRT through his doctor. He told his doctor, "Doctor, I'm tired of paying, all this money for testosterone through my pharmacy. I want to just do it on my own." And the doctor said, "Well, I don't recommend that, but I'm not going to tell you no. I'm still your doctor. I want what's best for you. I want your health. Only thing I want out of you is please get blood work done. Come back and get blood work done. That's all I want." So he said, fine. So 3 months later, the guy goes on Para Pharma testosterone, exact same dose as he was on from the clinic. Went back to the doctor for his checkup. Doctor checks him. Everything's good. Does the blood work. Doctor comes back and said, "You know what? This gear is perfect. I wouldn't even known you were on the gear from the pharmacy versus the gear you're on." And the doctor even asked him, "What gear are you taking? Because this stuff is really good." And that's the nice thing about Para Pharma is you can save money by using them. If you're using through your clinic, you're overpaying through an anti-aging clinic, which if you talk, you've seen my prior thoughts on anti-aging clinics. They're a bunch of 99% of them are
Oh man,
they're businessmen. When it comes to your health, it should not be for profit. All right. Your health is your health. There's something so unethical and disgusting to me.
Steve, let me just do the maths for you guys.
So let me just tell this, and then I'll let you jump in, Monster. I walked into an anti-aging clinic one time because I was running an article on anti-aging clinic. I walked in, it was like I was walking into a fast food restaurant. They had a whole menu on the screen of different things to order. They were trying to sell me to take this, take that, take this, take that. You should do cryotherapy. You should take these injectable vitamins. You need to do this. You need to do that.
This is skin shit. Yeah.
It's like going to an auto mechanic and the auto mechanic telling you there's a million things wrong with your car. So if you're currently paying all this money to go to anti-aging clinic, switch over to Para Pharma. It's the same fucking gear as the anti-aging clinic is giving you, and you're going to save a fortune. You'll save 75, 80%.
Oh, more than that, man. That's crazy. I was just going to say the numbers, right? The cheapest, I think we've heard, is $200, and the average cost seems to be somewhere between $200 and $300 a month. Now, you guys can look for these prices yourself. You can go on and look at the Para Pharma products via the resellers and look at the kind of cost, right? And I suspect you're looking at something like UK prices, Steve. I worked this out, right? Test CPNA. This isn't what I'd pay. If I walked into my local gym and I said, "What have you got?" and it's the CPNA, I think I'd be looking at 30, 35 pounds. I'm just going to use that number. So that means a single jab once a week is going to cost me £3.50, which is about $5, maybe a little bit under $5. So that's for $20 a month, Steve, right? Versus $200 a month. Now, even if the domestic market, the US market, with shipping, because I'm not getting it from over the counter, I'm getting it through a company like Para Pharma, and it's being sent across country to me, it's still going to be a fraction. But honestly, if Steve said 80%, it'd probably be nearer 90%. The only thing, exactly like that great doctor that Steve referred to earlier on, is I would encourage you to put a few bucks aside and get 3, maybe 4 blood tests a year, just to see where you are, just to see what your values are, just to see if you need to tweak what you're doing in terms of dosaging, make sure your lipids are good, etc., etc. And that's just on the TRT side. When it comes to running a cycle, it's on another level again. And Para Pharma is one of our trusted sources. It's one of our approved sources for a reason, because we know the product is solid. We talked about PIP being great now versus what it used to be. Blends out there that companies are producing, like Para Pharma, products that we know work. And again, just on the testing side, very quickly, guys, as a finish the show, we've had members with their own bucks send us products like Para Pharma, and including Para Pharma, in fact, off for testing, and every single product, including Para Pharma, came back on point within the deviation that's allowable with huge pharmaceutical companies. So every single product was there or thereabouts. I think it was 2 or 3% off across the range in terms of the variability across the range of products that were tested. And it was multiple products from multiple different sources, including Para Pharma, and every single goddamn product come back as it should do. Keep that in mind. Let us know what you think, and definitely fingers crossed, Steve, like Steve said, for talking about a stacking in an upcoming podcast. Please note, we are not doctors, and the opinions are ours. It is our view based on our experience and views on the topic. A podcast are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.